YAML has been an intricate part of Kubernetes, and it still is. It's the language that we speak to our clusters. When we talk to our clusters using kubectl or Helm, we use YAML. The command line tools takes the YAML, validates it, and then parses it. It then creates JSON, which it uses for client to server communication. And then all the server calls happen via API, and they generally happen via JSON. So server-side communications mostly in JSON, and all the client-side stuff is mostly YAML. This is because when these tools started out, YAML was chosen because it's easier for humans to read and work with, compared to something like JSON, which is designed for servers and processors to communicate. So most of the client tooling uses YAML for human interaction. But over the years, there's been a lot of pain when it comes to the YAML, especially on the client side, and especially with YAML configuration errors. On the Kubernetes enhancement Git repo, there's been a new enhancement proposal introducing KYAML, a safer, less ambiguous YAML. So today we take a look at KYAML or KYAML or camel, or however you want to pronounce that. Let me know in the comments below. We're going to take a look at what KYAML aims to solve, how it helps, why it exists, and how it affects you. So without further ado, let's go. Now, all of the details about this change is described in the enhancement proposal on GitHub. With the introduction to KYAML, it's got the summary, the motivation of this change, the non-goals and goals, proposals, design details, and more. It's a wealth of information that covers the change. The enhancement proposal also has a link to the GitHub issue. Here you'll find an enhancement description with details about the changes, and it looks like this is set to release as an alpha release with Kubernetes 1.34 as described here. It looks like beta and stable is still on the cards. And if we take a closer look at this GitHub issue, you'll see that this is a one-liner enhancement, so you can add KYAML as an output for kubectl. By now you should know that you can use kubectl to say kubectl get deploy or get pods. You can also say output as YAML, and you can get all the pods or deployments as a YAML file. This allows you to use kubectl to export objects to YAML or JSON from your cluster. And this means that according to this GitHub issue and proposal, in Kubernetes 1.34, we should be able to say kubectl get pods -o KYAML. And we'll be able to start exporting objects from our Kubernetes cluster into KYAML format. And if we take a closer look at this issue, there are some linked pull requests. And this is the pull request that highlights some of the changes, adding KYAML support for kubectl. Now, the description in this GitHub pull request gives a bit of a clue on what's going on. So KYAML is a strict subset of YAML, which is sort of a halfway between YAML and JSON, and we'll take a look at this in a bit. It has the following properties, so it does not depend on white space. I think one of the most frustrating things for developers dealing with YAML is this whole indentation and white space issue. You define objects like parent, child nodes, and the tree structure using white spaces, spaces or tabs. And it's very easy to make a mistake and break the whole structure. You'll see things like always quoted value strings, so you'll start seeing a lot of quote. In YAML, there was not always quotes on values. In certain cases, you may see quoted keys. We'll talk about all this in a bit. Always using curly brackets for objects and using square brackets for lists. Things like allowing trailing commas, allowing comments. We'll take a look at all of this in a bit. There are some examples here that would be interesting to you. So here's an example of an object, a Kubernetes object. This could be a pod, service, deployment, or config map, or anything. Notice here that there's no indentation. Although there is indentation here, this is just something for us to visually read it. So it's nice on the eyes. It has the visual appeal of YAML, but it doesn't come with the indentation drawbacks because every object is clearly defined by specifying curly brackets. So you can see metadata, we have curly brackets surrounding the metadata, curly brackets for the labels, and that is the first thing. Secondly, you see all the values have quoted strings. There is no ambiguity here. Then if we scroll down, we see a list. In YAML, we indicated a list with a dash. So you would have IP families and then you would have dash IPv4 dash IPv6. With KYAML, it'll be similar to JSON. So it'll be square brackets. So if I pasted this into VS Code, that's kind of what it looks like in KYAML. And then if I take a look at normal YAML, you'll see this is how you specify arrays or lists. So in KYAML, it looks a lot like a JSON array. If we take a look at other examples, you can have a list of objects, similar to a Kubernetes service where you have a port specification. Here you can see I have opening bracket, close square bracket. So this is defining a list of ports, and then inside you have each port. This is an object and this is an object. So there's two ports inside of this array. So this is a KYAML list of objects, whereas this is the list of objects we're used to in YAML. So in YAML, we're purely relying on the dash characters to indicate the start of a new object, and then we're purely using indentation. And then another example is you can still have multi-documents within KYAML, which looks similar to the original YAML of maintaining a dash separator between YAML files. So we can still do and maintain multiple KYAML documents in one file. So that is a very light preview of what you can expect and what you can expect KYAML to look like. But why KYAML? We've talked about YAML not being able to handle spaces well. And you may remember the old and still ongoing debates with the development communities around tabs or white spaces. Do you prefer tab characters or do you prefer 2 spaces? Or should it be 4 spaces? That challenge and arguments and debate goes into YAML as well, because YAML is very sensitive to the number of indentations used. Personally, for me, I don't have a problem with indentation. I think that's more of a human problem. After the indentation issues, looking into KYAML, we now have strings. Now, as you can see in these examples, all of the values are quoted as strings. So why is this? This takes us down a small rabbit hole called the Norway problem. So just giving a shout out to the author of this blog called hitchdev.com, which clearly explains what's called the Norway problem. So if you have YAML like countries, this looks very innocent. We have a list of countries here with Norway at the bottom. Now when you parse this through programming language parsers, in this case they're using PyYAML as a parser, you'll see that PyYAML will load this file and then create a dictionary out of it. It's important to know that when programming language reads YAML, it has to parse the format. This is the same with JSON. Many of the tools for Kubernetes are written in Go, but this problem is not specifically to Go. In this case, a Python parser is used, but programming languages have to parse YAML in order to make it readable in memory. So in this case, a Python parser is used, and look at the output. We've got countries as a key, that's the key up top here. Then we have a perfectly crafted array, and we have perfect country strings just like they are shown in here. But at the end, we're expecting NO as Norway, but we get false. This is because YAML parsers try to be smart with things like Boolean values. Zeros and ones can be interpreted as true or false. The actual words true and false are interpreted as Boolean, or they can be, and yes and no can be interpreted as Boolean as well. To fix this, we can replace the Norway with strings. So here's an example. We can go ahead and fix that by putting quotes around no for Norway, and when that parses, you now see it works. So it actually parses it correctly now. But this means we have to then strictly use and enforce quotes, which is not the case for most parsers. That again requires humans to enforce the quotes themselves. And then you have problems with strings and float values. These are just version numbers. But remember, for parsers, this is actually like a number. This could be a decimal or a float or something different. Now look at the value. If you change the Postgres one slightly and not put a .0 at the end, look at what the parser does. It's got 3.5.3 perfectly, but the 9.3 does not come as a string. But if you go and put strings around it, then it works perfectly. So you can see it's a problem with country codes, problems with numbers, but it doesn't end there. In this example, you have a person with the name Christopher Knoll. So somebody who has Knoll as a last name. If you write this as YAML and you go ahead and parse it in Python, you get a surname none. This is because with YAML, Knoll is also recorded as none, as a none type object in Python. If you fix it by just adding quotes around it, then it works perfectly. So you can see by putting quotes on all the values, it solves a lot of these challenges. This is why KYAML is a stricter subset of YAML. KYAML is still YAML under the hood. It just means that KYAML parsers will enforce the quotes, which fixes all of these issues. Now, if I go back to some of these examples and I take another look, this is starting to look a lot like JSON to me. So why not just keep using JSON? Now, this is a perfectly valid and good question. When you start putting JSON and KYAML side by side, it can look very similar to the point where you might question why even have this? Well, it's important to know that JSON has its own limitations. JSON has a strict quoting enforcement, so you have to quote all the keys, not just the values. So when comparing JSON and KYAML side by side, you'll notice that with JSON, all the keys are quoted as well as all the values. If you take a look at KYAML, it is not the case, it's only the values. So you can argue that KYAML looks a lot nicer on the eyes and is closer to YAML. And when you start quoting everything, it kind of looks a little uglier and not so nice on the eyes. But I'll leave you to be the judge of that. The other thing is with KYAML, I'll be able to just put comments. I'll just be able to say new comment, and I'll be able to do this on the trailing line. At the end, I'll be able to add a comment over here, and it'll maintain the comment capability that YAML provides. And we all should know that JSON does not support comments by default. We cannot technically do this in JSON, and we also cannot put it in new lines unless we use specific subsets of JSON like JSON-C, which supports comments. So JSON does not look as nice, it's not as appealing on the eye, it doesn't work well with humans. It's more for server-to-server communication. So what are the most impactful upcoming changes? So if we go through the enhancement proposal, through KEP 5295, we scroll down, you'll start to see the summary. Now, the biggest important change that's coming is kubectl get -o KYAML. This will allow you to use kubectl and get the KYAML out. Then they talk about some of the motivation, and we've covered this already. So first of all, getting the KYAML out, white spaces being an issue in YAML, which we already addressed. They talk about string quoting, like the Norway bug or Norway challenge. We talked about the alternative to YAML, which could be JSON. Why not just use JSON? We talked about JSON having its own drawbacks, and it does not support comments. It's very particular about trailing commas, and it requires quoted keys as well. The most frustrating part is that YAML doesn't have to be this bad. It's a very broad specification. So the whole thing with this is to be able to change the tooling and the examples in the Kubernetes documentation so that the YAML format, now KYAML, would be less error-prone dialect of YAML. So it would avoid the pitfalls of YAML and reduce common mistakes and frustrations. So that leads us to the goal. So KYAML will be a simple dialect of YAML, which is 100% compatible with existing parsers and tooling. They'll provide the libraries for all this, provide KYAML output for kubectl. This is what we'll expect in Kubernetes 1.34. They'll go across the whole Kubernetes repo and all the documentations and update examples throughout the project. And this will address common YAML pitfalls, and they'll document the design and reasons for KYAML. And there are some non-goals, which is important to know. They don't want to introduce an alternative configuration language. They're not going to add any server-side support for KYAML distinct from what they already support in YAML. So this is important because these changes only really affect the client side, not the server side. And they will not require projects to migrate to KYAML by default. They will not change the YAML library used by Kubernetes. Then we get to the proposal. Now, since KYAML will be a subset of YAML, it should always be accepted as the input. So you'll be able to do something like kubectl create or kubectl apply and pass KYAML object in. But this proposal does not demand such input, so you can still opt in to pass normal YAML. So the users can choose to violate the spec as long as the result is still valid YAML at the end of the day. And this is what we covered. So always use double quotes as values, unquoted keys unless they are not obviously safe, and then using curly brackets for structs or objects and brackets for list or arrays. I think the best thing here is not only the Norway bug, but it means that KYAML is not white space sensitive, which makes templating like Helm charts and things and patching a lot easier. So this is actually called flow style instead of the old conventional block style. Now this might sound a lot like JSON because it actually is. They go on to say that JSON is valid YAML, and KYAML is friendlier than JSON, and it's friendlier for humans to read and to write and to commit to source control. But unlike JSON, KYAML will go ahead and it will allow comments. It'll also allow trailing commas on the last lines of lists and structs, and does not require quoted keys. So to go ahead and create these changes, what they will do is they'll add new code to go ahead and serialize any object into KYAML. They'll introduce kubectl get output as KYAML, which uses this new package. Then they'll go ahead and create new tooling, which reformats YAML and JSON into KYAML. They'll also work with these special interest groups to go ahead and update documentation across the board. With all of that said, there is always downsides, but what are they? If I go through the entire proposal, there is a section on multi-line strings. Now they say for better or worse, multi-line strings are a thing that people do in Kubernetes, and conventional YAML makes it pretty easy. So if you look at this, you can just simply pass in an example, create the pipe character, and then start embedding files. You can also go ahead and embed YAML into YAML. You can go and embed bash scripts into config maps, or XML into YAML and embed that into config maps. You can actually embed multiple documents within each other and embed them in YAML. YAML allows you to do this. This is important in config maps and secrets. Sometimes we embed documents inside configuration files for apps to consume. This also happens in a lot of cron jobs where you have an odd bash script. You might embed bash directly into a config map and then have that consumed by a job. Now the argument here is that this is not valid YAML in flow style, because this is kind of block style. So YAML will use folding flow escaped line breaks to get close to the original format without sacrificing the main goals of the skep. And if I take a look at what this looks like in KYAML, I think this is pretty ugly. You're now introducing line breaks at the end of each line with quotes in the front, and you're using backslashes in this example. This is very ugly when you start looking at embedding bash, or let's say you have nginx and you're using Lua and Perl scripts to be embedded into config maps. You need to start escaping within escaping within escaping. And you can see the hell that would create, and it makes it really hard to read these files when they're embedded. So this is one thing I consider a downside. This is taking away from YAML, not improving it. And it's also something that I'm sure everybody does. Config maps gives you the capability to embed documents, and you will embed whatever document your application needs. Perl scripts, bash scripts, XML, JSON, and now you need to escape within those documents, and you need to be sure that when those documents are mounted into a pod, that escaping is still taken care of, and it's just going to look ugly and cause human errors. The next one is the whole commas thing. This is so close to JSON, because in KYAML, we'll have to start putting commas back in, similar to JSON. But KYAML always has a trailing comma at the end. This would be invalid if you did this in JSON and passed it. But in KYAML, you have to have a trailing comma. You can see there's a trailing comma in this object as well as over here. Paired brackets are always cuddled unless the next item has a head comment or previous item has a foot comment. And here's another example, and I believe this doesn't look good for humans documents to read at all. And if I look at the following examples, I don't even want to begin to look at what's going on here. It defeats the whole purpose of YAML being easy on the eye. We're now so close to JSON, we might as well go back to JSON. In these examples, the earlier examples were great, but in these examples, we may just go back to JSON completely. But I'll let you be the judge of that. Now, when this change comes out, you can start running kubectl get and put -o KYAML and start getting an idea of what that looks like. Here are some examples. kubectl get -o KYAML, get a service called hostnames. And we can see all the values here are quoted. We can see all the objects have curly brackets around them. We can see that arrays always have square brackets. They're always cuddled like this. We can see integers or numbers are not quoted. Here's an example of getting endpoint slices. So that is what KYAML will look like in the real Kubernetes world when it comes out. And it's important to always look at the alternatives. What are the alternatives? We could just go back to JSON and deal with the challenges. JSON with all the trailing commas and comments not being supported, we could use libraries like JSON-C. The alternatives are perfectly described in the enhancement proposal. We could either use JSON, we could tell users to use JSON with comments, we could ban the use of raw JSON and instead use JSON with comments via YAML parsing in all configuration logic. You can see the alternatives are a bit difficult, and they also mentioned that we could adopt HJSON, JSON-C, or JSON-5, and this would all require choosing between them, taking new dependencies, learning new grammars, and all of them are very similar to KYAML, which has none of those drawbacks. So what are your thoughts about KYAML? I think it's great for parsers, and it clearly solves a lot of YAML headaches, especially on the client side, and frustrations for users, especially the indentation. On the surface, I think it solves a lot of problems, and it still kind of maintains human readability. But there are some cases with multi-line strings and embedded documents where I think it's gone a bit too far and takes away from YAML and doesn't add any value there. And in certain cases, things just look a lot more like JSON instead of YAML. I'm glad to see the community are taking steps and actions to improve the frustrations of YAML and try to resolve some of those issues. But these come with some sacrifices, and for those I'm kind of on the fence still. We'll see. Let me know down in the comments what you think about these changes, and how do you pronounce KYAML or camel. If you liked the video, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell so you know when I upload next. And if you want to support the channel even further, hit the join button down below and become a YouTube member. And as always, thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.